Eugenie Sage.
Mr Chair, the Green Party also believes that this bill should be referred back to Select Committee because this 16-page supplementary order paper includes quite sweeping changes. It includes inspection powers from the Search and Surveillance Act, changes to the Biosecurity Act in relation to the eradication of unwanted organisms, and to the whole consenting regime for existing petroleum mining activities, which are licensed under the Continental Shelf Act. Mr Chair, it's good law-making when the Select Committee has an opportunity to consider changes of this scope in more detail, because we, like other members of the opposition, want this bill to be robust law. We want it to be enduring, but the way in which the process has occurred, the fact that we have tried constructively to make amendments through giving the Minister a number of SOPs last month, only to have the SOP 100 dropped on us last Friday, isn't good lawmaking, putting these quite major changes that are in this SOP in the legislation without it going back to Select Committee and without the Select Committee having had the benefit of seeing how the package as a whole works. Because certainly, Mr Chair, this legislation is overdue. We do need to fill this major gap in our environmental management regime, the fact that we don't have a consenting regime to regulate activities in the EEZ and in the extended continental shelf, when this is the 5th largest EEZ in the world. So we certainly support the need for the legislation, but it still has a number of flaws. Because the Minister has, with her announcement in the SOP, that we were getting rid of the balance criteria that was in the last purpose and clause, and the proposed referral to the sustainable management provisions of the RMA has created the impression that there has been a move away from the pro-development bias of the bill as introduced. It certainly is more consistent with the RMA, and it's certainly desirable to have that consistency of purpose between what is inside the 12 nautical mile territorial sea and what is outside it. But I think, Mr Chair, there are a number of fishhooks, and the bill is not as consistent with the RMA as the Minister and others on the government side have implied, because there's a fundamental difference between this bill and the RMA, and that is that in the RMA there is a hierarchy of matters to be taken into account when decisions are made. There are matters of national importance which decision makers have to recognise and provide for, whereas under the bill, the matters that the decision makers take into account are all to be given equal weight with no emphasis on environmental protection and sustainability. So the priorities then conflict, and there's no guidance to decision makers about the relative weight to be given to each of the matters. And that, Mr Chair, will mean that there's much more likely to be a focus on short-term economic considerations, because the financial benefits are so much easier to quantify than damage to a species or damage to habitats. So it's this lack of a hierarchy to guide decision makers that's a critical difference between the bill and the RMA, and the fact that there are no environmental bottom lines as there are in the RMA through Section 6 and Section 7. And so, Mr Chair, there's a real risk when you don't have those environmental bottom lines that decisions are quite subjective, because it's just like a big washing machine that all these criteria come into play, and there's no prioritisation of the most important factors. And, Mr Chair, there's also a major difference here, because, and the real risk that the purpose won't have the sustainable management purpose won't have the weight that it has in the RMA, because there is no equivalent in this bill to Section 104 of the RMA, which requires decision makers to have regard to various considerations subject to Part 2 of the Act, and would invite the Minister to comment when she next takes a call on whether this is a deliberate omission, so that the bill means that herself as Minister and the EPA won't be required to make their decisions subject to the bill's purpose in Clause 10, or whether that was just a slip because the SOP has been come into play relatively late. So, Mr Chair, there's a supplementary order paper 89 in my name which seeks to address some of these issues. address the lack of environmental principles. It seeks to better implement UNCLOS. And Mr. Chair,
Sage.
and it's the UNCLOS requirement to preserve and protect the ocean environment before exploiting it commercially, by including a set of environmental principles to help guide decision makers, to help them prioritise. And that would mean, Mr. Chair, that they would be required to recognise and provide for a series of matters rather than just taking them into account. So they put the emphasis on those matters. And that would help us, Mr. Chair, implement our responsibilities under UNCLOS to preserve and protect the marine environment, because the matters that are listed in the supplementary order paper include maintaining the integrity of marine ecosystems, protecting and preserving rare or fragile habitats, and preserving and protecting threatened species. But those get given greater weight than they are at the bill at the moment. And, Mr. Chair, we think that that would then take a step forward to making the Act much more consistent with the RMA and the prioritisation and the hierarchy that you get in the Part 2 of the RMA, and giving that sort of a similar prioritisation in this bill. Thank you.
I call Andrew Williams.
Chair, I take a call on behalf of New Zealand First on this bill, and can I say that when this first came before the House, New Zealand First did oppose it because we had concerns about the Clause 10, the purpose of the bill.